Hello there! So, you know how sometimes when you're lying in bed late at night, you come up with what feels like a genius idea, then you wake up the next day to realize just how stupid or unrealistic it was? Yeah, usually I don't follow through on my sleep-deprived delusions, but curiosity took over a few days ago. See, I was thinking, for some reason, about how people on Osu play with different playstyles. You got tablet and keyboard, mouse and keyboard, and mouse only to name the popular ones. In mapping though, there's no variety like that. Everyone uses keyboard and mouse. So then, why don't I try mapping with some other layouts? That not even original idea is what came to mind one night, and despite how stupid it seemed the next morning, I decided to give it a test over the next couple days. I mapped under different circumstances to answer some simple questions. How does each piece of equipment compare to one another in terms of convenience and practicality? And more importantly, could I create okay maps with other input devices? Mouse only felt like a good first baby step. It allows just about everything needed for normal mapping right off the bat: timeline control, placing objects, and selecting object types, albeit manually. To make this a little more interesting though, I decided not to use any standard object orientation shortcuts that usually make up my patterns. Mouse only is like, I want to call it raw mapping. It's basically how every new mapper starts since they don't know hotkeys, so setting this limitation for myself somehow felt right. As for other shortcuts, I bound the two essential ones that everyone quickly learns to side buttons on my mouse. Spacebar for pausing and playing the map, which would be 10 times slower if I had to actually press these buttons every time, and F6 for opening the timing panel and adjusting slider velocity. With that, I was ready to map. Maybe too ready. I expected to struggle, but one-handed mapping was just as time efficient and nearly as comfortable as normal two-handed mapping under these conditions. Minor things were all that bothered me, such as the finality of sliders. Without access to the control key, I couldn't modify sliders after they were initially created. So like, if I wanted to make a curve out of a straight slider, I needed to redraw it entirely. Then also, for all my streams, I couldn't force stable spacing without pressing Alt and adjusting distance snap. Eyeballing based on the numbers up here was my best option. In the end, what tripped me up more than anything else wasn't restrictions, it was just my own habits. I kept my left hand away from the keyboard because if I hadn't, I would have definitely pressed some shortcuts. When accidentally moving an object or a slider node, there were a few times when my hand moved without thinking to the undo Ctrl-Z command. Also, I don't know how to explain it, but not being able to spam Ctrl-S made me really anxious. Repeatedly saving a map is a habit of mine when thinking about where to place objects, which anyone who watched that 1 hour video likely caught on to, and I couldn't do that with mouse only. Realistically speaking though, none of these were actual problems. I could bind all those hotkeys to other buttons on my mouse and overwrite my habits if necessary, nullifying all my complaints. Even with those complaints in mind though, mapping with mouse only was comfortable, though it probably wouldn't have been if I had to manually navigate the edit menu for clean object orientation. Forsaking copy and paste here was a good choice, I think, in spite of the imperfections it caused. Not that most people would have noticed the imperfections anyway. After making this mouse-only map, I went through and recreated all its patterns with shortcuts as I would when normally mapping. That showed how, even without shortcuts, I still think about arrangements in terms of geometric rotation, and how my eyeballing of placements is pretty on point. Not everything was eyeballed correctly, of course, but it was still weird to see how close multiple things were. The differences, I imagine, aren't noticeable in gameplay, so I could realistically be satisfied with my own raw, no shortcut, mouse-only mapping. Intermission story time. Last January, I went to an Osu LAN event at UC Irvine, where I made a short collaborative map with the mapper Nathan. We both brought our crappy laptops to work on, but Nathan didn't bring a mouse, so he was left to map slowly with a trackpad instead. I managed to finish my parts of the map first, so I let him use my mouse afterwards, and all turned out okay, but, you know, trackpad is slow, inaccurate, and frustrating to use. Would it have potentially been easier to map with keyboard only? No. No. While cutting the keyboard out of ordinary mouse and keyboard mapping is reasonable, the same can't be said about the opposite. You've got shortcuts everywhere, but like, you can't click or move the mouse. How are you supposed to move objects on the playfield, or even place objects for that matter? Keyboard exclusive mapping shouldn't be possible. Yet, through some silly workarounds, it can be done. I first bound some extra controls through a program called Auto Hotkey, turning my caps lock key into the equivalent of Control plus left click, and my tilde key into right click. Moving the mouse with Auto Hotkey is technically possible, but it defeats the point of mapping keyboard only, so I went with another method for placing my first objects: the forbidden technique. At least that's what I've heard it jokingly called. If there's .osu files in a maps folder, they can be accessed via the Control-O difficulty menu, and for whatever reason, objects can be directly copied and pasted between difficulties when switching this way. By keeping my mouse cursor permanently aligned with my timeline cursor, I couldn't place objects on the playfield, but I could copy them from other difficulties and adjust them with keyboard commands. Everything about this was the pain I initially expected. Handling object locations was time-consuming because analog arrow key movement was my only replacement for a mouse. Using the Control-O menu thing was extremely inconsistent too, sometimes not being selectable and sometimes forcing me to leave a difficulty when pressing escape. Given I was using a keyboard, I hoped to at least have an easy time with keyboard shortcuts, but manually tabbing through all the options in the scale window to adjust a slider's length was a major nuisance. Maybe that's my own fault though for changing slider velocity in every white tick, which in itself was a pain to do because the timing panel has 100 different buttons to tab between. Using a mouse would have been infinitely easier. So many temptations. Good thing I had my mouse above my keyboard, because otherwise I would have instinctively grabbed it a few times. So okay, no secret, keyboard-only mapping is a bad idea. It took me an hour and a half to map 25 seconds, whereas it took a bit over that much time to map the TV-sized mouse-only map in its entirety. Keyboard is slow. But I mean, it still worked. My keyboard-only map looks like any other ordinary map, unaffected by the handicap. I obviously wouldn't use keyboard alone over an annoying trackpad and keyboard, though the result turned out to be better than I thought it would. Back to Nathan's dilemma. He was using a trackpad because he had no mouse, and keyboard only would be worse. He did have a tablet though, so why didn't he map with that? It's pretty much a mouse, right? So many people use it for OSU gameplay that it can't be bad. To see for myself, I pulled out my tablet and... Right, I don't have a tablet. I can't give up now after so much investment though. To see for myself, I packed my bags and took a trip to meet someone who had a tablet I could use for my 4 AM mapping ID adventures. There, I learned that I hate tablet mapping more than anything. Tablet and keyboard is definitely more convenient than keyboard alone. I mean, you have an extra tool, but it's sort of like the uncanny valley of mapping. I can move a mouse cursor and perform shortcuts, yet everything feels wrong because I don't have precise control of either the playfield or the timeline. You can see this pretty clearly. The mouse is shaking everywhere due to me hovering over a small tablet area, which ruins any exact object placements I want. I also couldn't create sliders easily because right-clicking to end a slider body was one of the pen button's functions. Pressing that button while hovering and not creating more slider anchors rarely worked as intended. Then combining those problems, I sometimes had to delete extra slider anchors, which required surgeon-like precision that could only be achieved with 2 hands. What bugged me way more than that was managing the timeline though. When mapping, I do this thing where I rewind and play a map repeatedly, so not having immediate access to the buttons controlling that is like the equivalent of having to think about breathing and blinking. Every time I wanted to move in the timeline, I needed to shift my hand from the tablet to the arrow keys, completely throwing me off and causing me to lose concentration. In hindsight though, I could have just rebound my arrow keys to something accessible from my left hand and that would have been problem solved. Oh well. But anyway, mapping with tablet turned out to be slower than keyboard only for me just because of the pen inaccuracy and mental disconnect involved. At least the map turned out okay though. Aside from inconsistent visual spacing, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between this and mapping normally. So congrats Nathan, out of what was available, Trackpad was the right choice. However, could there be a better way? Like another input method completely separate from mouse and keyboard that works better than a trackpad? Partially yes. I hate using trackpad because it has the same mental disconnect as tablet, where you need to move your hand between the trackpad and the arrow keys to manage movement on the playfield versus the timeline. While it may not be a proper play method for OSU by any stretch, using a PS4 controller, yes, a PS4 controller, was surprisingly okay for mapping. After opening OSU through Steam's Big Picture mode, it's easy to set controller bindings to keyboard and mouse buttons according to what's important in mapping, which in my case turned out like this. The most vital things here, for me anyway, are timeline controls being accessible effortlessly and 2 types of mouse movement. This left stick allowed for large motions, while the trackpad in the middle allowed for the more granular precision needed for exact patterns. I think I was just accustomed to the torture by this point because I felt like mapping with a controller was way more comfortable than keyboard only or tablet keyboard mapping. My main problems came from switching between large and small mouse movement controls, since I ended up prioritizing the stick more than the trackpad and sacrificed accuracy. Managing slider shapes was also pretty hard without a tight grasp on key bindings, but that issue was solved quickly as I adapted. As for the map, I would say it turned out okay, sorta similar quality-wise to the tablet map. I would show it to you in full here as I've been doing, but Osu had other plans and crashed, deleting all my progress. I suppose that's a downside of controller. I needed a Control-S binding. If I had that, and the other commands I use regularly while mapping like copy, paste, and rotate, I feel like this wouldn't be all that bad. An error has occurred, it says. Oh, can I save my map? Please? 3 objects. Well, I'm done with controller then. Nathan, if I had a PS4 controller with me at the time, I would have given it to you. And you would have used Trackpad anyway because anything else related with a controller is stupid. A PS4 controller is nowhere near as stupid as the last device I tried though. A device infamous for its impracticality. The Wiimote. You don't need me to tell you this was bad. Using motion control as a mouse this far away is miles worse than the jittery tablet I tried earlier. Key bindings were manageable through a third-party program, but anytime I clicked, the cursor would freeze for half a second, and considering how inaccurate my cursor movement is, you can imagine I needed to recreate objects a lot, especially slider shapes. At least I could increase Osu's resolution and the size of the timeline for more lenient aim. Otherwise, this would have been even more shaky than it already is. Despite all that, the one saving grace of the Wiimote compared to, well, at least my tablet mapping and trackpad mapping, was the timeline controls. I could maneuver the timeline without thinking, and that was enough to turn at least what should be a frustrating way to map into something fun. While I never would have been able to stand it for more than the 30 minutes I did, mapping with the Wiimote was enjoyable. Too bad the map was unsurprisingly rubbish. Anyway, late night curiosity satisfied. These have been my experiences with map creation using different input devices. It should now be clear why every mapper uses mouse and keyboard. Everything else is objectively worse. Finding a better input device wasn't the goal here at all though. I more so just wanted to see what sort of novelty could be found by mapping in ways I hadn't done before. Usually that's done more on the internal side of things with innovative next-gen map design or whatever, but doing so externally has its own merit too, at least for the person on the production side of things. And hey, I learned that if I ever lose a hand somehow, I'll still be able to place circles. So yeah, thanks for watching and I'll see you next week. And special thanks to rthe for making this video possible.